Now, before I dive deep into a comparison between my Lightsmith Tree and the version of Blizzard that they have out on December 19th, I'm going to say a few words about my general impressions of the trees that are available for me to look at as of the time I'm writing this. Most of the trees have a theme that is set with the Tier 1 hero talent and built upon throughout most of the tree, a lot like my ideal trees. There are talents here and there, especially at Tier 4, that have nothing to do with the Tier 1 talent, but plenty of talents that build off of the Tier 1 talent in one way or another. Exceptions to this are the as of yet unformed Druid trees, simply because they're as of yet unformed, and the Chronomancer tree. I was actually surprised that Chronoflame was a no-frills upgrade for Living Flame and didn't have any gimmicky flavor that it set up for the rest of the tree. It feels weird being as no-frills as that. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not against no-frills talents in the hero trees in general. I've got plenty of them in my own first draft Paladin trees. I just don't think Tier 1 is the place for no-frills hero talents. I figure Tier 1 is for the talents that have a gimmick that sets the tone and flavor for the rest of the tree. And in most cases, Blizzard seems to think the same thing. For one example, the lightning damage added to several abilities for Mountain Thanes by their Tier 1 Lightning Strikes passive. There's plenty of talents throughout the Lightning Thane talent tree that buff that damage or let it kick in from other sources. Another example is the hero talents that buff or add to the procs of Vampiric Strike for Sand Lane. Lightsmith is quite similar, but I'll get into that later. I'd also like to say that a few talents seem to almost be upgrades in their own right. Chronoflame is almost an upgrade for Living Flame, when with a minor tweak it would be. Vampiric Strike is a variation of the upgrade concept that sometimes replaces one ability on your spellbar with another, and is de facto a new proc. So Blizzard probably wouldn't be closed to the idea of ability upgrades in general like the kind I have in my ideal talent trees. The main question is whether they'd be open to the idea of having two abilities per tree that get upgraded on a more or less permanent basis, insofar as one ability on your spellbar is replaced by another ability on your spellbar for as long as you have the hero talent that upgrades your ability. Personally, I think that the variety of having more than one ability be replaceable is what the trees really need in order to be exciting. On the plus side, Blizzard is definitely open to the idea of upgrade abilities replacing one ability for one spec and another ability for another spec. They pretty much have to be, since there are plenty of classes whose specs do not share core abilities. Vampiric Strike is a perfect example of that. Heart Strike is not on Unholy Spellbar, and Scourge Strike is not on Blood Spellbar. I've wondered how upgrade abilities could possibly work for a class like Warlocks, where Destruction has Immolate and Incinerate, while Affliction has Corruption and Shadow Bolt, and none of these abilities overlap between the specs. Well, now I have some idea. I was surprised at how empty the Druid trees were. I suppose that's a sign that Blizzard is still quite early in the planning process, and if I'm fortunate, that means they're willing to pivot on big things like the upgrade abilities. In any case, I was a little shocked that there was exactly one new active ability in all of the talents that Blizzard showed, and it was at Tier 1 of the Lightsmith first draft. Holy Armament certainly sets the tone for the Lightsmith tree, tossing out a doodad that an ally can walk over to pick it up and get a buff, and that kind of reminds me of Mist Orbs for Monks or Soul Fragments for Demon Hunters, except it's a core buffing ability for Lightsmiths, which does fit the flavor of the Lightsmith name, I have to admit. And the question of whether it's a defensive or offensive buff, it alternates. That's a good dose of utility. And 10 of the 15 talents buff Holy Armaments in one way or another. Some of the talents directly buff healing or damage, but few of them buff mitigation directly except through Holy Armaments, which I find a little surprising considering this is a protection tree as much as it's a holy tree. Then again, everything that buffs Holy Armaments also buffs the damage mitigation that it can provide for you, so maybe it's okay that they do it that way. Looking at this tree, it doesn't seem to do that much to change how you play. It gives you one more button to push that you didn't have before, and it makes that one new button more awesome. It gives your allies something to look out for on the battlefield, something that can make them more resilient or more powerful. My Lightsmith tree, by contrast, encourages you to be strategic in how and where you spend holy power. As a tank, you can buff allies by getting them in your shield glare, and as a healer, you can damage enemies by getting them in your shield glare. Single target healing with Light of the Protector becomes more strategic and powerful, forcing you to spend more holy power with Shield Glare or Light of Dawn or Shield of the Righteous. Heals do more to protect yourself and allies, encouraging and enabling off-healing for tanks and off-tanking for healers. It affects how you play quite a bit, and at times blurs the line between tanking and healing gameplay. I admit I'm biased about this, since I'm the one who came up with my trees, but I like to think that my tree is a bit better than Blizzard's. There is another thing to talk about vis-a-vis the structure of the trees. At the time I was putting together my ideal trees, I did not realize that Blizzard wanted to have 1 talent point per node, and I did not realize that the first node was always free. Plus, I didn't bother counting the nodes for that matter. There's 11 of them, and with the first one free, with 1 talent point per experience level and 10 experience levels in War Within, that means all the hero talents will eventually be yours, with the sole exception of the pick one of 2 talents. One of the 2 you'll need to forego each time. My assumption going into my ideal talents was that you wouldn't be able to get all of the nodes. There would be a few of them that you would need to forego. The only way that would happen would be if some of these nodes required more than 1 talent point to fill them up. I did not put enough thought into how many talent points each talent node would require. I guess in the back of my mind I had some idea that it would be possible to get all the active abilities, but if you did, you'd need to sacrifice a lot in the passives department. And it would be more likely that any given player would get 1 active ability, get the capstone new ability, and several passives, and that depending on what playstyle you want to try out, it would be easy to change up which active ability and which passives you could get. Heck, I figured there'd be some viable builds where you forego the capstone and focus on the 2 replacement abilities and the cooler passives. Now that I am thinking about how much of the hero talents a player can and cannot get with the talent points that they're budgeted, I've realized that there are definitely benefits to a system where you're going to get everything, and the real choice is which perks you get first. Artifact weapons in Legion were like that, and I loved them for it. There was no real fear of missing out when you were navigating the nodes in your artifact weapon. It was just the ability to grab cool stuff and wondering what to get first. I hate to say it, but there's also cons to a system where you get everything. For example, my Devoted Protector off-specking talent is the kind of thing that ought to exist in a system where you can choose not to get it, where you give up something that specializes you further in your spec's chosen role, specifically so you can specialize yourself in a secondary role. That is playstyle customization. Systems where you get everything do not offer playstyle customization. So I went into this project assuming that a player couldn't get everything but would end up getting most things in the tree. That is why I have a great deal more interconnectivity in my trees than Blizzard has in theirs. The fact that Blizzard's hero trees are designed so each player gets everything means that the lack of interconnectivity in their trees isn't really a problem at all. In a system where you can't get them all, interconnectivity is a much bigger issue since it limits player choice. For the rest of this project, I'm going to assume that there are at least a few nodes in my trees that require 2 talent points to fill them up. I've not yet hammered out which ones, but I figure that the more powerful the talent is, the more likely it is that it should require 2 points. Divinity should take 2, for example. I'd also like to say that if my trees are going to be a system where you have to pick and choose which hero talents to get and which ones not to get, then I should probably have even more player freedom than I currently do and switch away from a nodes and edges talent tree system to a more vanilla-like talent tree system where how deep you get to go is limited by spending thresholds rather than which specific talents you've gotten. That would, in theory at least, allow a player to jump straight from Tier 2 to Tier 4 without getting anything in Tier 3, just as long as they'd spent enough points in Tiers 1 and 2 to get past Tier 4's talent point requirement. That would allow for much more player freedom. For that matter, it would also allow a player to jump from the left side of the tree to the right side, or vice versa. The question of how many talent points a player can get and how much different tree nodes are going to cost is going to be crucial in figuring out how good these trees are, and I know that. It's something that I left out in my first iteration. If I make more iterations, I know I'm going to need to think about it. Feedback about that, and about pretty much everything else here too for that matter, would definitely be appreciated.